The night was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the soft hum of streetlights flickering along the empty road. He drove slowly, paying attention to the road signs and the occasional movement of trees swaying in the wind. It had been a long day, filled with meetings, phone calls, and decisions that left him mentally drained. All he wanted now was to get home, have a cup of tea, and finally unwind. The streets seemed calm, almost peaceful, and he let out a sigh, hoping the rest of the drive would remain uneventful. But peace was fragile that night. Out of nowhere, he noticed flashing lights behind him. At first he thought maybe he had exceeded the speed limit, though he was certain he had not. The red and blue lights reflected off his windshield, casting eerie shadows across the dashboard. He felt his heart rate pick up slightly, a familiar tension settling in his chest. He knew the routine: pull over, stay calm, answer questions, but this time, something in the air felt different. He carefully guided his car to the side of the road, signaling properly, and turned off the engine. The clicking of his seatbelt coming undone echoed in the stillness. Two officers approached from opposite sides, their steps heavy and deliberate. Their hands rested on their belts near their holsters, and their eyes scanned him from head to toe. Even from a distance, he could feel the intensity of their gaze, the kind that made someone feel immediately judged. "Good evening, sir," one of them said, his tone polite on the surface but sharp underneath, like a blade hidden in a sheath. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" He shook his head gently, keeping his voice calm. "No, officer. I'm not sure." The other officer stepped closer, his face tense, and added, "You were driving kind of erratically back there. Care to explain?" He could feel the judgment in their words. It wasn't just about traffic rules. It was in the way they looked at him, their eyes scanning for something he hadn't done. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet there was this underlying assumption, this suspicion that didn't need words. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, palms flat, showing he meant no harm. But every muscle in his body was alert. "I was just trying to stay within the speed limit and get home safely," he said evenly. "Is there something specific that seemed off?" The officers exchanged a brief look, almost imperceptible, but he caught it. There was doubt there, not about him, but about whether they could trust him. The first officer leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Step out of the vehicle, please. We just need to ask you a few more questions." He hesitated only slightly, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate the situation. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. The night air was cool, brushing against his face, and for a brief moment he considered turning back, driving away. But he knew that would make things worse. He stepped out with his hands raised slightly, showing cooperation. The second officer moved to the driver's side, his posture rigid. "Hands where I can see them," he said, his tone now harder, less friendly. He raised his hands, keeping them steady. "Of course, officer. Here they are." Then it happened. In an instant, what had started as a routine traffic stop turned into something much more dangerous. The first officer drew his gun, pointing it directly at him. The night air seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, and a sudden fear gripped his chest. He froze, not out of panic but out of instinct, understanding that any sudden movement could trigger a catastrophe. "Step away from the vehicle, slowly," the officer commanded, his finger on the trigger. He complied, taking slow, measured steps backward. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. The distant hum of the city seemed muted, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. He could see the tension in the officers' faces, their bodies coiled like springs ready to snap. He stayed calm, focusing on his breathing, reminding himself that fear could cloud judgment. "Why are you so nervous?" the second officer sneered. "You've got nothing to hide, right?" He knew that this was more than a question. It was an accusation wrapped in casual words, a test of his behavior under scrutiny. "I'm calm, officer. I'm just trying to understand what's going on," he replied, his voice steady, controlled. There was a pause. The officers exchanged another glance, their movements stiff and calculated. It was clear they had made assumptions about him before he even spoke. The night felt colder, the shadows longer, and the sense of danger more pronounced. He could see it in the way their eyes darted, in the subtle trembling of the first officer's hand holding the gun. He kept his hands raised, shoulders relaxed but alert. He needed to communicate that he was not a threat, even as they treated him like one. "Officer, I'm not trying to resist or cause trouble," he said. "I just want to cooperate and resolve this." The first officer's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "We're just doing our job," he said, as if that justified the gun pointed at a man who had done nothing wrong. He nodded slowly, taking in every detail of the moment. The positioning of their bodies, the tone of their voices, the tension in the air. Every instinct told him to stay composed, to not let anger or fear show. One wrong word, one sudden gesture, and this could go horribly wrong. Minutes felt like hours. The quiet of the night was broken only by the officer's commands and the sound of his own shallow breathing. He reminded himself to speak calmly, to respond with reason, not emotion. He wanted them to see him as a human being, not a threat. Then he noticed something, a subtle shift in their demeanor, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, a hesitation in the way they held their weapons. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to show that their confidence wasn't absolute. He realized that while they had assumed control, their control was fragile. He took a slow breath and chose his next words carefully, knowing the right approach could change the course of the night. "Officers, I understand you're cautious," he said. "I'd like to cooperate fully, but I need you to know that I mean no harm." There was silence. The officers didn't lower their guns, but the stiffness in their posture lessened just a fraction. It was a small sign, but enough for him to continue. Every word, every gesture had to be precise. There was no room for error, he continued. "I'm confident we can handle this calmly. I want to make sure this ends safely for everyone, including you." The first officer's eyes narrowed. "Safe for everyone? You realize we don't take chances, right?" He nodded, keeping his hands visible. "I do, officer, and I respect that. I'm just asking for the chance to show that there's no problem here." The tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching endlessly. He could feel his heartbeat, steady but fast, his mind calculating the best way forward. He was aware of the danger in every word, every breath, every slight movement. Yet he stayed calm. He reminded himself that panic would not help. He focused on what he could control, his voice, his posture, his words. The officers might have assumed the worst, but he could influence the moment by staying human, by showing reason and authority in his own quiet way. He could see it now. The officers were struggling with the contradiction between their assumptions and the reality before them. The man they had assumed was a threat was composed, respectful, and careful. That dissonance created a crack in their certainty. He decided it was time to take the next step, to gently assert a presence that could not be ignored, to give them a reason to pause before the situation escalated further. The right word, the right revelation could shift the balance completely. But for now he remained still, hands raised, voice calm, eyes steady. The night was tense, the danger real. And yet he knew that in that moment patience, composure, and human understanding were his strongest tools. The officers had assumed control, but the next moment the story could change entirely. The night seemed heavier now, thicker, as if the air itself had become charged with tension. He stayed still for a moment, letting the cold air brush against his face, trying to remain as calm as possible. The officers' guns were still pointed at him, and their eyes flicked nervously between him and the car. He realized that any sudden movement, any word spoken too sharply, could make this situation spiral into disaster. He knew the first officer was waiting for him to react, to flinch, to make a mistake. The second officer seemed more focused on checking the area around the car, glancing down the empty street as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. He could see the faint reflection of their badges glinting in the dim light of the street lamp, their authority heavy in the quiet night. Yet behind that authority, he sensed unease, a crack in their confidence that he could use carefully. "Listen," he said slowly, his voice calm but deliberate. "I want to cooperate. I'm not a threat to you or anyone else here. Can we handle this without anyone getting hurt?" The first officer's eyes narrowed. "You keep saying that, but we've got a gun pointed at you. That's standard procedure." "I understand," he replied softly. "I don't want to challenge your procedure. I just want to make sure this situation ends safely for everyone. If I move slowly and follow your instructions, will that help?" There was a pause. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The officers were human after all. Even in uniform, even with guns drawn, they were people with nerves, doubts, and instincts. That thought gave him a small measure of confidence. If he could speak to that humanity, he might guide them to see reason. The second officer finally spoke, his voice harsher now. Step closer to the car. Hands visible. No sudden moves. He nodded and moved carefully, step by step, making sure to keep his hands raised and visible. The cold air bit at his skin, but he ignored it, focusing entirely on the officer's reactions. He noticed that as he moved, the first officer's hand shook slightly. Not a lot, just a tremor that revealed tension he was trying to hide. "Why are you acting so nervous?" the first officer asked. Though his tone lacked real anger now, there was curiosity beneath it mixed with disbelief. He took another measured breath. "Because I know how dangerous this moment is for all of us. I want to prevent anything from going wrong. That's all." The silence stretched. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves, felt magnified in that stillness. He knew that these moments were fragile, that any wrong step could tip the balance, but he also sensed that the officers were beginning to question their own assumptions. Their eyes flicked to his face, searching for a clue, and he stayed calm, steady, unyielding in his composure. He decided to speak again, carefully choosing his words. "Officers, I know you're used to dealing with people who might not cooperate. I want to show you that I am not one of them. I'm just a man who wants to go home safely. Can you give me a chance to prove that?" The first officer's grip on his gun loosened fractionally. The second officer lowered his shoulders slightly, though not his weapon. He noticed the change and held his composure, refusing to let relief show too soon. The night was dangerous, and he could not afford to assume the situation was over. "Where were you headed tonight?" the second officer asked, his voice now slightly softer. He paused, thinking carefully before answering. "Home, that's all. I've had a long day and I just want to get there without any trouble." The officers exchanged another glance. He could see their skepticism, but also a flicker of doubt creeping in. They had expected defiance, resistance, maybe even fear, but instead he stood there calm, collected, and respectful. That did not fit their assumptions, and it threw them off balance. He took another step, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. "I understand your job is difficult. I respect that. But pointing guns at someone who is not a threat, I think we can handle this better, don't you?" The first officer frowned, his finger tightening again on the trigger. "You think you know better than us?" "No," he said firmly. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm showing you that there's another way to handle this, one that keeps everyone safe. That's all I want." Time seemed to stretch as the officers hesitated. The tension was almost unbearable. He noticed a car pass in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and he realized that someone might see this scene if it escalated. That thought made him even more careful. Every word had to count. Every movement had to be controlled. The first officer spoke again, his voice lower, almost uncertain. "Why are you talking to us like this? Most people would be scared out of their minds by now." He kept his hands raised, shoulders relaxed. "Because fear doesn't help anyone. Calmness helps. Respect helps. I'm showing you that we can handle this without violence, without mistakes. That's all I'm asking." There was another long pause. He could feel the officer's uncertainty growing. The balance of power had shifted slightly. They had assumed control, but he was showing that control could be guided by reason and composure, not just weapons and authority. "I need you to step closer to the vehicle," the second officer finally said, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. He complied slowly, raising his hands higher just to show there was no threat. He moved deliberately, each step calculated, maintaining eye contact with the officers. Every move was meant to communicate cooperation, respect, and calm. The first officer's eyes flicked down to the car, then back to him. "You're not giving us a reason to doubt you yet," he said, his tone softer now, unsure. He nodded. "I understand. I just want to make sure this ends safely. That's all I care about." For a brief moment, the world seemed suspended. The officers' guns were still drawn, but the edge of tension had softened slightly. He noticed the first officer's hand shaking again, just a little, and he realized that his calmness was affecting them. By staying steady, he was showing that the situation could be handled without aggression. "Do you have any identification?" the second officer asked. He reached slowly into his pocket, keeping one hand visible at all times. He handed over the ID carefully, making sure not to make any sudden movements. The officers examined it, their eyes scanning the details. He could feel the shift in their demeanor. They were starting to see that he was telling the truth, that their assumptions had been premature. The first officer lowered his gun slightly, though he did not completely holster it. The second officer kept his at the ready, but his stance had softened. The tension was still there, but it was no longer as sharp, no longer as immediate. He took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice steady, calm, and firm. "I appreciate that you're doing your job." "I respect that. I just want to make sure no one gets hurt tonight. That's all I ask." The officers exchanged another glance, the uncertainty in their eyes growing. They had expected fear, confusion, maybe defiance, but instead, they were confronted with calmness, clarity, and human composure. That contrast unsettled them more than he could have imagined. He realized that this was his chance, the moment where he could assert the one thing that would completely change the course of the night. He needed to speak with authority, to remind them that there was a higher level of accountability, one that they could not ignore. He took a small step closer, keeping his hands clearly visible, and let his next words hang in the night like a carefully placed weight. The air seemed to pause, waiting for what he would say next. The officer's eyes widened slightly, sensing that something important was about to happen. And then he knew. One simple, precise statement could freeze the moment, shift the balance completely, and make them reconsider everything. He just had to say it calmly, without anger, without arrogance, just truth delivered with confidence. The night held its breath. The streetlights flickered slightly. The distant hum of the city continued, and he prepared to speak the words that would change everything. The night was still, almost as if the world itself had paused to watch what was about to happen. He stood there, hands raised, shoulders relaxed but firm, heart steady but alert. The officers' guns were still drawn, though their fingers were no longer tense as before. There was a flicker of hesitation in their eyes, a subtle questioning of the assumptions they had made moments ago. He had remained calm, careful, and deliberate, and it was beginning to show cracks in their confidence. He took a slow, measured breath. Every instinct told him that the moment had arrived, the precise point where words could change everything. He had to be careful. One wrong choice, one slip of tone, could undo all the careful composure he had maintained. The cold air brushed against his face, sharp and biting, but he barely noticed. His mind was entirely focused, calculating, observing. "Officers," he began, his voice calm, steady, and firm. "There's something I think you need to know." The first officer's eyes narrowed. "And what is that?" he asked, a mix of skepticism and lingering authority in his voice. He held their gaze evenly. "I am the FBI director." The words hung in the night like a sudden crack of lightning. Time seemed to stretch, elongate, slow down. The officers froze. Their hands twitched near the weapons, but neither lowered them. Shock was written plainly across their faces. Their earlier confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by disbelief, uncertainty, and a twinge of fear. The first officer's mouth opened, then closed. He blinked rapidly as if trying to process the statement. "What did you just say?" he stammered. "I am the FBI director," he repeated, his tone calm but unmistakably authoritative. "Everything you're doing right now, pointing weapons, making assumptions without evidence, it's being observed and recorded. I want this situation handled calmly and safely." The second officer looked at him, eyes wide, voice shaking slightly. "Are you serious? That can't be real." He remained still, composed, unwavering. "It is real," he said. "I suggest you lower your weapons and take a step back. You have a choice right now. Handle this professionally or escalate unnecessarily and face consequences." The officers exchanged another glance, their earlier aggression completely gone. Their training had taught them to assert control, to maintain authority in tense situations, but now the authority had shifted. They were uncertain, hesitant, unsure of what to do next. The balance of power had shifted entirely. He noticed the first officer's hand trembling slightly, the gun still in position but no longer held with the same confidence. The second officer's posture was tense, his eyes darting nervously between him and the car, searching for a hidden signal, a clue, anything that would explain the sudden turn of events. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "This isn't about defiance. It's about ensuring that no one gets hurt tonight. I am giving you the opportunity to step back, to do your job correctly and to end this safely." The officers hesitated. Seconds passed like hours. He could feel the tension in the night, heavy and palpable, pressing down on everyone present. The cool air did nothing to ease it. He realized that at this moment the situation could go either way. But he also knew that his calmness, His control over his own demeanor was influencing them more than anything else could. The first officer swallowed hard, lowering his gun slightly, though not fully. His eyes were wide, scanning him as if trying to confirm that he was telling the truth. You're really the FBI director?" he asked, voice trembling. "Yes," he replied evenly. "Everything you are doing right now is being observed. I expect professionalism and respect for procedure. Lower your weapons and step back, and this ends safely. Escalate unnecessarily and you will face the consequences." The second officer's hand shook visibly now, and he took a small step backward, glancing at his partner for confirmation. The first officer mirrored the movement slowly, still holding his gun but with less tension in his body. Their disbelief was palpable. They had assumed control, assumed authority, but the reality in front of them did not fit any of their expectations. He kept his hands raised, shoulders relaxed, but alert, eyes steady on them. "We can end this without conflict," he said. "You have the chance to act professionally. I suggest you take it." The first officer finally spoke, voice quieter, uncertain. We didn't know. We didn't expect." He waited patiently, allowing the officers to process the gravity of the situation. Silence stretched, heavy and tense. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. But even that seemed muted, overshadowed by the moment's intensity. The second officer's hand began to lower slightly, though the gun was still present. His eyes avoided direct contact now, flicking nervously. He seemed unsure how to respond, trapped between their training and the undeniable authority of the man standing before them. He spoke again, calmly, assertively. "I am giving you clear instructions. Step back, lower your weapons. This is your opportunity to handle this correctly." Another long pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, the first officer lowered his gun completely, hands trembling. The second officer followed suit a moment later, finally releasing the tension in his posture. Their disbelief remained, but the immediate danger had diminished. He kept his stance firm, voice calm. "Good, now take a deep breath. Make sure your focus is clear. We are all here to avoid mistakes, and this is the first step toward that." The officers nodded slowly, still in shock, still trying to reconcile the moment with their expectations. He could see the internal struggle on their faces, part of them wanting to challenge the statement, part of them realizing the truth could not be denied. "I know this is unexpected," he said, "but it is also an opportunity. You have the chance to act correctly, professionally, and safely. That is what matters." The night felt slightly less oppressive now, though the tension lingered like a shadow. He noticed that the officers' hands were no longer trembling as much. They were cautious, still uncertain, but the immediate threat had faded. He took a careful step backward, keeping hands visible. "Now I suggest you both return to your patrol positions, reassess, and make sure this situation is handled according to procedure. That is all I ask." The first officer's voice was shaky. We need to radio this in." "Yes," he said calmly. "Do so, be accurate. Be professional, and make sure no further mistakes happen." The second officer moved toward the patrol car, pulling out his radio with trembling hands. The first officer followed, still glancing nervously at him. The night had shifted, changed completely from moments ago when weapons were pointed and tension was at its peak. Authority had been challenged, assumptions exposed, and the balance of power had shifted without a single act of aggression on his part. He stayed where he was, hands raised for another moment, observing the scene, ensuring the officers complied fully. The silence of the night was now different, quieter in a strange way, almost respectful. He could feel the gravity of what had just happened, and yet he remained composed. Panic would serve no purpose here. Control and patience had won the moment. Minutes passed. The officers finished their radio checks, glanced at him one last time, then began to move back toward their vehicle. Their demeanor was subdued, wary, and respectful, though their disbelief lingered. He could see the careful consideration in their movements, the caution that had replaced the earlier aggression. He finally lowered his hands, keeping his composure steady, but allowing a sense of relief to wash over him. The immediate danger had passed. The officers were no longer pointing guns. The tension, though still present in the night, had diminished significantly. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, grounding himself. Every step, every word, every measured movement had led to this moment. The night had been tense, almost unbearably so, but composure, Calm authority and strategic communication had turned the tide. As the officers returned fully to their patrol car, still processing what had occurred, he realized how fragile the situation had been. One wrong word, one sudden gesture could have ended it differently. He had navigated the perilous moment carefully, relying on patience, observation, and human understanding. The night held a lesson silent and clear. Authority, respect, and calmness could shift even the most dangerous situations. The officers had assumed control, but reality had challenged their assumptions, reminding everyone present that human composure could sometimes be the most powerful force. He took another breath, adjusted his posture, and prepared to finally continue on his way home, aware that the night would leave a lasting impression on both him and the officers who had underestimated him. The lesson lingered in the quiet streets under the dim glow of the streetlights as the night slowly returned to its usual calm. The night felt different now, heavier in a quiet way, but calmer than before. The immediate danger had passed, yet the tension lingered like a shadow stretching across the road. He remained standing by the car for a few moments, hands now lowered but still relaxed, watching the officers as they moved back toward their vehicle. The way they carried themselves had changed. Their earlier aggression was gone, replaced with cautious awareness and almost hesitant respect that had not existed before. He could see the internal conflict in their expressions. They were trying to reconcile what had just happened with the reality of the man in front of them. They had assumed he was just another driver, potentially dangerous, someone who might resist, flee, or even attack. But instead, he had shown patience, calm, and authority. His words had been deliberate, clear, and human. He hadn't raised his voice or moved too quickly. He had communicated without aggression, yet every word carried weight. As the officers returned to their car, he felt a sense of relief, but he didn't let himself relax completely. He knew that the situation was far from ordinary, and even though the immediate threat had passed, he needed to ensure the encounter ended safely. One mistake, one sudden action could undo all the careful navigation of the night. "Everything okay back there?" The second officer finally said, his voice quieter, almost cautious. "Yes," he replied evenly. "It's fine now. I appreciate your cooperation and professionalism." The first officer, still holding the radio, nodded slowly. His hands were steadier now, but his gaze was still wary, thoughtful, as if replaying the events in his mind. The disbelief in his eyes was clear. They had gone from confidence to doubt, and now, after seeing the calmness and authority of the man they had stopped, they were somewhere between respect and confusion. He took a step back toward his vehicle, careful not to rush or make sudden movements. He wanted the officers to see that the situation had shifted completely, that there was no longer tension to escalate, and that he intended to leave safely, responsibly. The second officer spoke again, his voice steadier now but still cautious. "You handled that well. I mean, we didn't expect it." He smiled faintly, maintaining calm but allowing a hint of warmth in his tone. "Thank you. I understand why you approached cautiously, and I appreciate that you listened. That's all I wanted, safety for everyone." There was another pause. The officers were silent, clearly processing the events of the past few minutes. He noticed subtle signs of reflection, the way the first officer shifted his weight, the second officer's eyes lowering briefly, a sign of thoughtfulness. These were people who had been trained to act in a certain way, but human nature had intervened, forcing them to question their own assumptions. He thought about how fragile the situation had been. A single wrong word, a sudden gesture, or even a tone of voice could have escalated it to something dangerous. Yet patience and calm had prevented disaster. The experience left him reflective, aware of how quickly ordinary encounters could turn life-threatening when assumptions were made too quickly, especially when authority and bias intersected. "Take your time," he said finally. "Check your reports, make sure everything is recorded correctly. And remember, this could have ended differently if handled carelessly. I hope this night reminds you to always act carefully, no matter the situation." The officers nodded slowly, taking in the words. There was an acknowledgement there, subtle but present. It wasn't an apology. Exactly. But a recognition that the encounter had been a learning moment, one that they would likely replay in their minds for a long time. He stepped closer to his car, opened the door and sat down for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. He let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. He could still feel the tension lingering in his body. his muscles tight from the adrenaline of the encounter. But there was also relief, the knowledge that careful navigation had prevented harm. As he started the engine, he glanced back at the officers. They were returning to their patrol positions, their movements cautious, measured, as if the night itself had reminded them that authority could be challenged by reason and composure, not just by force. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had changed the course of events simply by remaining calm, patient, and deliberate. The drive home was quieter than usual. The streets seemed almost surreal, the usual sounds of the night muted by the lingering thoughts of what had just occurred. He reflected on the delicate balance of power and the responsibility that came with it. Even though he held a position of authority, he had relied not on status alone but on human connection, careful words, and steady presence. He thought about the officers, about their training, and about how assumptions could cloud judgment. It was clear that their approach had been influenced by unconscious bias, assumptions made too quickly based on appearances rather than facts. That realization left a lingering discomfort, a reminder that even professional training could not entirely prevent human error. Yet there was also hope. The officers had responded ultimately to reason and calm authority. The encounter had ended without violence, without disaster. That was a testament to the power of patience, observation, and deliberate action. He felt a sense of responsibility, not just for his own safety, but for the broader lesson that could come from this experience. As he drove further, the familiar streets of his neighborhood came into view. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off the pavement, and he felt a quiet reassurance in the ordinary rhythm of life returning. He could still feel the weight of the night pressing lightly on his mind, but it was tempered by the understanding that careful choices had prevented tragedy. He thought about how easily events could have turned out differently, about how small actions and words could escalate or diffuse tension. It was a lesson in human behavior, in authority, and in the fragile balance between fear and reason. That reflection stayed with him, settling into his thoughts like a quiet echo of the night's intensity. Finally, he pulled into his driveway, turning off the engine, and sat for a moment in the stillness. The quiet of his home street was a stark contrast to the tension-filled hours just past. He opened the door, stepped out, and let the cool night air wash over him. Every breath felt purposeful, grounding him in the calm after the storm. The officers were still visible in the distance, returning to their patrol car, likely replaying the encounter in their minds. He knew this night would stay with them, as it would with him, a reminder of how quickly assumptions could lead to danger and how calm, deliberate action could prevent it. As he walked to his front door, he reflected on the broader implications. The night had revealed more than just a tense encounter. It had shown the power of composure, the importance of communication, and the reality of human assumptions. It had been a lesson in safety, awareness, and restraint, one that he hoped would resonate beyond just the individuals involved. He entered his home quietly, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment. The weight of the night's events settled in his mind, but it was no longer a burden. Instead, it was a reminder, a lesson about humanity, authority, and the importance of patience and understanding in tense situations. Sitting down finally, he reflected on what had just happened, thinking about how close the situation had come to turning violent. Every instinct, every careful word, every deliberate action had mattered. It was a powerful reminder that even in moments of fear, calmness and presence could change the outcome entirely. The night outside was quiet, the streets calm once more. Yet the memory of the encounter lingered, a vivid reminder of the fragility of human assumptions and the strength of patience. He knew that this experience would stay with him for a long time, shaping how he approached similar situations in the future. And as he finally let himself relax, he realized that the night had not just ended safely. It had also taught a profound lesson about human behavior, about authority, and about the difference that calm, deliberate action could make in the face of fear and misunderstanding. The next morning arrived quietly, but the memory of the night before remained vivid. He woke with a sense of reflection, a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Even though the immediate danger had passed, the experience was still heavy on his mind. He thought about how close it had come to a tragedy, and yet at the same time, he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that composure, calmness, and careful communication had prevented disaster. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming his hands, and replayed every moment in his mind. From the first glance of the flashing lights to the tense confrontation at the side of the road, each detail seemed alive, each choice he had made now carrying weight. He realized how easily one wrong word, one sudden gesture could have changed the outcome completely. It was a humbling thought, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how important patience and presence were in moments of crisis. As he reflected, he thought about the officers too. They had come into the situation assuming authority, assuming control, and assuming threat based on appearances. But the events of the night had challenged those assumptions. He wondered what they were thinking now, how they were processing the encounter. Did they realize the weight of their actions? Did they understand the fine line they had walked? He hoped they had learned something valuable, that authority was not just about power, but about responsibility, careful judgment, and the human element that often got overlooked. The encounter had made him think deeply about the larger issues at play. It wasn't just about one traffic stop or one night. It was about the assumptions people made based on appearances, about the way fear could cloud judgment, and about the importance of accountability and awareness in positions of authority. These lessons weighed heavily on him, not as resentment but as understanding. It was a chance to reflect on the complexities of human behavior and the responsibility that came with knowledge and power. Later that day, he considered sharing his experience in a way that could be meaningful. Not to boast or exaggerate, but to highlight the dangers of assumptions, the need for calmness in tense situations, and the importance of human understanding. The story was a cautionary tale, one that could educate and inspire others, both in positions of authority and in everyday life. He thought about the community as well. If people could hear what had happened, perhaps they could see the broader picture, the dangers of bias, the importance of patience, and the power of measured, deliberate action. He wanted the story to encourage reflection, to spark dialogue about responsibility, respect, and the way society could improve interactions between authority figures and citizens. Throughout the day, he remained thoughtful, replaying each moment and analyzing it. How had he stayed calm? How had he communicated effectively? How had he influenced the officer's behavior without confrontation or aggression? These questions were not just about pride in surviving the moment. They were about understanding the dynamics that had allowed the situation to resolve safely. He remembered the officers' expressions, the subtle shifts in their posture, the way disbelief had replaced aggression, and finally, the cautious acknowledgement that his words carried authority. Those moments were vivid in his mind, teaching him that human behavior was complex, that authority could be challenged with reason, and that respect and calmness were more powerful than fear and assumption. The memory of the night also made him consider the impact on the officers themselves. They had faced a situation that challenged their assumptions, forced them to question their training and instincts, and ultimately taught them a lesson about human judgment and bias. He hoped that the encounter would stay with them, that it would influence how they approached future situations with greater care, awareness, and patience. By afternoon, he began to think about the broader societal implications. The night had revealed not just personal danger, but systemic issues, the way assumptions, fear, and bias could escalate situations unnecessarily. He reflected on the need for better training, for awareness of unconscious bias, and for communication skills that emphasize de-escalation and human understanding. The experience had opened his eyes to the delicate balance between authority and responsibility, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose to advocate for change in small but meaningful ways. He also thought about the importance of human connection, even in brief encounters. Despite the tension and fear, there had been a shared humanity in the exchange, the acknowledgement of life, the need for safety, and the recognition that actions had consequences. That shared human experience, even under extreme circumstances, had been what ultimately resolved the situation. Authority alone had not won the day. Calmness, communication, and understanding had. The evening came, and he sat by the window watching the quiet streets outside. The shadows of the night seemed less threatening now, replaced by a sense of reflection and learning. He considered writing down his experience not as a sensational story, but as a lesson in patience, authority, and human judgment. Perhaps sharing it could help others see the importance of composure in tense situations, the dangers of assumptions, and the power of deliberate, thoughtful action. As he reflected, he realized that the encounter had changed him in subtle ways. He was more aware of human reactions, more thoughtful about communication, and more patient in assessing situations before responding. The night had been dangerous, intense, and emotionally taxing, but it had also been transformative, offering insights into human behavior, authority, and the impact of calm, respectful action. He thought about the officers one last time before turning away from the window. They were people like anyone else, influenced by training, fear, and assumptions. They had been forced to confront the unexpected, to adjust their behavior, and to recognize the consequences of actions guided by bias rather than reason. He hoped that the night would remain with them as a lesson, just as it would remain with him, a reminder of how fragile and precious human interactions could be. Later, as he settled into his evening routine, he felt a quiet sense of closure. The danger had passed. The officers had returned to their duties, hopefully with a new perspective. The city continued its rhythm, unaware of the intense drama that had unfolded on one quiet street. He allowed himself a moment of gratitude, for safety, for reason, and for the human capacity to navigate fear and conflict with understanding and calm. He reflected on how the story could serve others. It wasn't just about him, or even about the officers. It was about the lessons in human behavior, the importance of patience and communication, and the need for awareness in moments of tension. It was a reminder that even in dangerous, high-stakes situations, careful, deliberate action could prevent harm and transform outcomes. Finally, he prepared for bed, carrying with him the full weight of the night's lessons. He knew that he would think about it often, replaying the events, considering what had worked, what could have gone wrong, and how subtle choices could change the course of events. The night had been a stark reminder of the power of calm, of authority used wisely, and of the human capacity to influence outcomes through reason, patience, and understanding. As he lay down, he allowed himself to relax fully for the first time in hours. The city outside was quiet, the night no longer tense, and the lessons of the encounter settled in his mind. He felt a renewed sense of responsibility, both to himself and to the world around him, knowing that human interaction, authority, and judgment could always be guided by care, composure, and respect. The story of that night, though intensely personal, was also universal. It reflected the challenges people faced when assumptions, fear, and authority intersected. It showed the power of calm, deliberate action, and the difference that patience, communication, and understanding could make in the most tense and dangerous moments. And as he drifted into sleep, he carried with him a sense of hope that others could learn from the experience, hope that human behavior could be guided by reason and respect, and hope that even in moments of fear, composure and understanding could prevent tragedy and create safety for everyone involved. The night had ended, but the lessons would remain. And in those lessons, he found both reassurance and purpose, a quiet reminder of the delicate balance between authority, responsibility, and humanity.